Internews in Kenya has been very focused the last couple of years on building journalist skills to use data for better reporting. And what I mean by that is, how do we improve the media's watchdog role using data so that they can do better investigative reporting and highlight important development issues in Kenya. So in that context, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how journalists can fill that gap that both Leo and Angela were talking about. Just because you have a tool, just because you have the data, doesn't mean you have that data has been transformed into useful information, and that doesn't mean that the public has access. So we've been really focused on getting journalists to bridge those two gaps between data and tools and society actually engaging in a public debate about what are the policy impacts of that data. So just quickly, one of the stories that our journalists produced was about a safety net program for the poor here in Kenya. And he got access to data showing that basically MPs had hijacked the program, and instead of dividing the money based on poverty indicators by county, the MPs had divided all of the money by the 47 counties independent of poverty indicators. So if you lived in Turkana and you're poor, you're like 8 times less likely to get access to this money. This had a pretty big public policy impact because journalists told the story. So they told the story, not just a dry data story, but they told a human story about people who were starving because MPs had hijacked the safety net program. So while the government knew this, they had this information, this wasn't getting to the people, and the government wasn't acting even though they knew there was misspending. So it took, this program led the news story on NTV. Before the end of the story, public was calling in, asking what was going on, and also the government ministries responsible for this data were calling and asking for the data. So they weren't even aware of the data that they had themselves. And then we got calls from donors saying, so the World Bank funds the safety net program, and they said, wait a minute, we gave that money out based on this poverty indicator scheme that was developed, and we had no idea that it was changed to divide the money evenly among counties. So this is just one example of how data that is public, that NGOs might know that corruption is going on, that misspending is going on, unless that somehow reaches the public and there's a public reaction, it's very difficult to get the government to change. And something very similar happened with the issue of drought in Turkana. One of our journalists did a study basically proving that if all the money that's right now given to emergency humanitarian food aid was invested in food security, that you could basically fix the issue of hunger in Turkana. And again, this data was cobbled from a couple of different sources, but really spawned public outrage. And right now, there was a draft drought reduction strategy that had been stuck in Parliament for a long time and wasn't advancing. And now those issues are coming back up in public debate as people realize that they can engage in the public policy debate and say, we need to push these things forward, and just greater awareness of using data of government misspending and why Kenya isn't reaching its development goals. So to go a little bit into how Cody started off this process, it was basically the catalyst for doing data journalism in Kenya. Kenya is the leader in the area of data journalism. But unfortunately, most of the stories that have been produced in the Kenyan media using data did not come from Cody. We had the same findings that I have found, that the data there, it wasn't clean enough, it wasn't complete enough, it wasn't timely enough. But Cody has really been an opportunity for journalists to leverage Kenya's open data policy when they do go to ministers and ask for data. They can say, look, Kenya has signed on to an open data initiative. You can't act as if it's proprietary data anymore. So even just the existence of Cody and the existence of an open data commitment has made it much easier for journalists and NGOs to go and insist on making that data public. And finally, I just wanted to, since we have all these great people in the room, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the data community in Kenya, because I think we realized, the nation is not going to open a data desk. It's not going to have a full staff data journalism team with statisticians and developers We don't have data.gov, and I think increasingly it's becoming more important to us to realize that we do need to grow a consolidated data community in Kenya. Already we're doing that a little bit. We're looking with the Open Institute to contribute the data we have to do more powerful storytelling with them. We use the research that groups like iHub are producing to make sure we're designing apps and stories and tools that are actually going to have an impact. And we're also working with NGOs and academics that are collecting all this great data. Like, I think the open data movement has meant that a lot of NGOs and think tanks are collecting data and then they sit in PDFs that nobody ever uses. So if we can form partnerships with media, with tech groups, and with these think tanks and NGOs to make that data more available and more accessible, we get a lot more bang for our buck. We get public outreach, the data gets disseminated, and that creates more of a demand for open data. So right now, we're kind of creating a parallel database to Cody. Like, each NGO has its data, we publish the data we have, but there's no consolidated place for that data. And I think if we all work closer together, we can ensure that the data actually meets the public citizens' interest, addresses those issues, and then we also have the database, the tools, and then the public outreach through community media, through TV and radio to make sure that information gets to the people. We encourage a public policy debate, and that can only push the open data movement forward.